Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always ready to explore.
Awesome. Well, this time we're heading back to ancient India.
Oh, interesting. What era are we talking about?
We're looking at a really pivotal period, roughly 1500 to 500 BCE. You know, that transition from the Indus Valley Civilization to what we call the Vedic period.
Ah, the Vedic period. I see we've got some listener-submitted sources, too. Should be interesting to unpack those.
Absolutely. So let's dive in, shall we? Before we get into the specifics of the Vedic period, I'm actually kind of curious about the civilization that came before, the Indus Valley people.
Yeah, they were quite remarkable, weren't they?
They really were. I mean, think about it. They had these advanced cities, complex trade networks, even a written language that we, to this day, still can't decipher.
It is a mystery that continues to fascinate archaeologists and historians.
Totally. And then, boom, they seemingly vanish.
Yeah.
What do we know about their decline around 1900 BCE?
Well, it wasn't quite instant, but the relative suddenness is definitely perplexing. We have these sophisticated cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, incredible urban planning infrastructure, and then poof, abandoned.
It's wild, right? So what are the leading theories?
Honestly, there's no definitive answer. Some scholars point to climate change, maybe a shift in monsoon patterns or a major drought. Others propose external invasions or even internal social upheavals that led to their downfall.
So it's still a bit of an enigma.
Very much so. But what we do know is that their decline created a vacuum, one that allowed for something new to emerge, enter the Vedic period.
Okay, so the stage is set. What exactly makes this Vedic period so significant? What should our listeners know?
Well, the Vedic period gets its name from the Vedas, obviously. This is a collection of sacred texts. Hymns, prayers, rituals, even philosophical ideas, all packed into these texts. And get this, initially, they were transmitted orally, passed down through generations.
Like orally, like word of mouth.
Exactly. Priests, poets, they memorized these texts, reciting them flawlessly. It was a crucial part of their tradition and played a huge role in shaping their beliefs and how society was structured.
Wow, that's incredible. Oral tradition. That's a powerful force, especially considering these ideas were passed down for centuries before being written down.
Oh, absolutely. The impact is undeniable. And along with this shift in how knowledge was preserved, we also see a physical shift happening. The population starts moving eastward, toward the Ganges River Valley.
So a change in location. Interesting.
Right. And the archaeological evidence suggests a change in lifestyle, too. Agriculture becomes more prominent, central to their way of life.
Okay, so we've got a change in location, a shift towards an agrarian society, and this fascinating reliance on oral tradition. What about the beliefs themselves? Who were the big players in their world, the Vedic pantheon?
Well, we start seeing gods like Indra, Agni, and Surya emerge as central figures.
Okay, tell me more about them.
Well, Indra, for instance, was the king of the gods,
Yeah.
associated with things like thunder and rain. Pretty vital for an agricultural society, wouldn't you say?
Makes sense.
And then there's Agni, the fire god. He represented purity and sacrifice. And of course, Surya, the sun god, embodied light and knowledge. These gods, their stories, the rituals associated with them, it was all central to Vedic life.
I'm starting to get a picture of this new worldview taking shape. And speaking of rituals, I know the Vedas outline quite a few, especially ones involving fire sacrifices. What was the deal with those?
Ah, yes, the fire sacrifices. They were more than just symbolic gestures, that's for sure. They played a crucial role in reinforcing the social hierarchy. The Brahmins, the priestly class, they acted as intermediaries between the gods and the people.
Right, the Brahmins. They were the ones conducting these intricate rituals, so essentially holding a position of power within society.
Exactly. Control access to the divine, and you control a lot more than just some flames. These rituals, alongside those hymns and prayers from the Vedas, provided a framework for understanding the world, your place in it. That delicate balance between humanity and the divine.
So profound. And this framework would go on to have quite a lasting impact, right? Setting the stage for later Indian philosophies like Hinduism and Buddhism.
Absolutely. The seeds of those later traditions were being sown during this time.
Okay, so we've got this shift in settlement patterns, the emergence of these powerful oral traditions enshrined in the Vedas, and these fascinating rituals all contributing to a whole new social and religious order. But I got to ask you about this Soma ritual. I keep coming across it in the research, and, well, it seems pretty out there.
Ah, the Soma ritual. Yes, this is where things get particularly intriguing. This ritual involved consuming a drink, a special concoction made from the Soma plant, and the identity of this plant. Still debated today, it's a real head-scratcher, that Soma plant, but the hymns, they describe it as having these divine properties. capable of granting immortality, even connecting mortals to the gods.
Okay, so more than just a way to get a divine buzz, huh? What else can you tell me about this Soma plant? What's the big deal?
Well, scholars believe it might have had, shall we say, hallucinogenic properties.
Whoa, really? So we're talking...
It's possible the ritual was a way to induce a trance-like state, maybe even a form of ecstatic communion with the gods.
Wow, that definitely adds a whole other layer to our understanding of Vedic religious practices.
Yes.
It seems like they were really pushing the boundaries of human experience in their quest to connect with the divine.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears a bit. We've been talking a lot about, these big ideas and spiritual beliefs, but what about everyday life during the Vedic period? What was the political landscape like?
From what we can gather from archaeological evidence and those Vedic texts, it seems like political organization was pretty decentralized. We see evidence of tribal groups led by chiefs or kings.
So not quite the vast empires we might associate with later Indian history.
Not yet. But remember, this is still a formative period. We're talking about the building blocks of a civilization. These early tribal societies, they were laying the groundwork for those more complex political structures that would emerge later. And as these tribes interacted, sometimes they'd clash, sometimes they'd cooperate. And gradually, larger kingdoms started to take shape.
Fascinating. And what about within those early societies? Was there a sense of social hierarchy? Like a pecking order?
Oh, most definitely. The Vedas actually hint at a social structure divided into 4 main classes. Varnas, they called them. You might recognize them as the precursors to the caste system we see in later Indian history.
Ah, yes. The Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras.
Right. Exactly. It wasn't as rigid as that later caste system, but those social divisions were definitely present. The Brahmins, the priests, held a position of high authority, followed by the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers. Then came the Vaishyas, the merchants and farmers, and lastly, the Shudras, who were the laborers.
So everyone had their designated role. Was there much social mobility? Could someone born a Shudra, for example, climb the ladder and become a Kshatriya?
Well, while there might have been some exceptions, the sources suggest social mobility was pretty limited. Your birth largely determined your occupation, your status within the community.
It's interesting to see how so many aspects of later Indian society really have their roots in this Vedic period. It's a time of such tremendous change, innovation, a period where the building blocks of a civilization are being laid. From religious beliefs to social structures, from philosophical ideas to political organization, it's all happening here. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, is there anything that stands out to you as particularly significant about this transition to the Vedic age?
What strikes me most is the transformative power of ideas. The Vedic period witnessed this incredible outpouring of creativity. Hymns, prayers, rituals, philosophical concepts, all coming together to shape a new worldview. And these weren't just abstract concepts. They had a real tangible impact on how people lived, how they interacted, how they understood their place in the cosmos. And what's even more remarkable is how those ideas, first expressed thousands of years ago, continue to echo in Indian culture and thought today.
It is pretty mind-blowing to think about that kind of impact, how something from so long ago can still hold relevance. But we've talked a lot about the content of the Vedas, these foundational texts of ancient India. What about the texts themselves? I mean, they were initially passed down orally, right? So how did they make that jump from spoken word to written scripture?
That's a great question, and it was anything but a simple or straightforward transition. We're talking about a time long before the printing press. These texts, they were painstakingly memorized and recited by generations of priests, a tradition that really ensured the continuity of those sacred teachings over centuries.
The dedication and effort involved is just incredible. To trust the preservation of your entire belief system to the memories of others, it's a true testament to the power of those oral traditions.
It really is. And this oral tradition, it wasn't just about rote memorization. It really had a deep impact on how the Vedas themselves are structured, the style of the language.
Oh, I bet. How so?
Well, think about it. They're characterized by this rhythmic, almost poetic style, full of repetition, mnemonic devices, all these things designed to make them easier to remember, easier to recite.
That makes total sense. It's like, what, an ancient version of setting knowledge to music?
Exactly.
So when did these oral traditions finally make the leap to written form?
It's tough to pinpoint an exact date, but scholars generally believe it probably began sometime around the first millennium BCE.
Wow, so centuries after they were first composed. That's a long time for these ideas to exist solely in the spoken word.
It is, and even then, it wasn't like some sudden event. The different Vedas, they were likely compiled and codified at different times. It reflects, how thought and practice evolved over time within the Vedic period.
So a complex and gradual process, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Do we have any theories about what might have prompted this transition to writing? I mean, was it simply the development of writing systems, or were there other factors at play?
It's a question that keeps scholars up at night, I think. Some argue that, sure, the rise of literacy, the development of writing systems in India played a role. As writing became more common, it's natural to want to preserve these important texts in a more permanent form.
Right, makes sense.
But others suggest that maybe the increasing complexity of those Vedic rituals contributed. As rituals became more elaborate, maybe there was this need for precise instructions, clear interpretations, and that kind of pushed people towards recording them in writing.
So it was a way to ensure consistency, preserve the knowledge.
Exactly. It's probably a combination of things, really, a convergence of cultural and practical developments, all leading to the Vedas finally being written down.
So we have this shift, this gradual transition from spoken word to written text.
Hmm.
But did that immediately make the Vedas like the authoritative scriptures we know today? Or was there another step in that process?
Whoa, there was another crucial step for sure. Canonization. Even after being written down, the Vedas didn't just automatically become those fixed, revered scriptures. The process of canonization, of establishing a recognized and authoritative body of text, that was gradual and honestly pretty complex. It involved, debates, different schools of thought, different interpretations of the text, and ultimately it required a consensus on which versions would be considered definitive, the ones that would make the cut.
So imagine all these ancient scholars poring over these texts, debating their meanings, arguing about which ones should be included in the final canon.
Oh, absolutely. It must have been quite a scene.
It makes you realize that the quest for knowledge, that passionate pursuit of truth, it's a timeless human endeavor.
You got it. And it's through that process, the discussion, the debate, and ultimately that consensus, that the Vedas gradually became the bedrock of Indian religious and philosophical thought. They became the source of authority, a guide for understanding the world, the cosmos, your place in it all. And their influence, well, it continues to shape the lives of millions even today.
What a journey these texts have taken, from spoken word to written scripture to revered canon. It really highlights how ideas can transcend time, can shape civilizations in such profound ways. We've covered a lot of ground today in our deep dive into the Vedic period. We explored the collapse of that mysterious Indus Valley Civilization, the eastward shift in settlement patterns, the power of oral tradition, those key gods and rituals, the development of social structures, and that absolutely fascinating journey of the Vedas themselves, from spoken word all the way to written text. And through it all, we've seen how this era laid the foundation for so much of Indian culture and thought, a legacy that continues to resonate even today.
It has been a fascinating exploration, that's for sure. And before we wrap things up, I'd like to leave our listeners with something to ponder. We've seen how those Vedic people created this rich and complex worldview, all built upon the foundation of the Vedas. But I wonder, how did their beliefs and practices differ from those of the earlier Indus Valley Civilization? How might those differences reflect, the changing social and environmental conditions of ancient India? Food for thought.
It's a great question to consider. And remember, listener, there's always more to discover. Keep digging, keep those questions coming, and keep those deep dives going.